Hey guys, so today we're going to be testing a really crappy CPU with a really good GPU. I did this already with a Celeron and a 4080. This time I'm going with an Intel Pentium Gold G6400 and I'm pairing it with an RTX 4090. I just want to see if the 4090 can put this processor on its back and still allow me to game without the backgrounds missing or without people floating everywhere. That's what happened with the Celeron and the 4080. Let's benchmark it, let's play some games, and it's going to be super sicko mode. So before we get started, please like and subscribe. It really helps me out. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments below. And every video I post will be more sicko mode than the last. All right, let's get to it. So an overview of the parts that I'm using. Obviously, I'm using the Intel Pentium Gold G6400. It's the LGA 1200 socket type. I'm cooling it with a thermal signal fan radiator. This processor doesn't use a lot of power, so cooling should be just fine. I went with 32 gigs of DDR4 3200 MHz G-Skill RAM, an MSI RTX 4090. This GPU is super heavy, so it has that little bracket to help support it, so it doesn't sag as much. And it's not like the cool sagging like when you were in high school and you thought sagging was cool. It's not like that. I'm using a 500 gigabyte WD Blue NVMe, a Z490 Asus Prime motherboard, and it's all inside of an NZXT 510i case. Overall, this build looks pretty sicko mode. The only downside of this is that the processor sucks. Everything else isn't too bad looking. Now, if we're talking about the specs of this processor, it's a 2-core, 4-thread, 4 GHz processor. Its TDP is 58 watts. It was launched in Q2 of 2020. It uses the LGA 1200 socket type, and that's kind of it. It's not really an exciting processor. The Pentium processor is for basic office use. If you need to type up some documents, do some Excel spreadsheets, that's really all it's designed to do. So let's just see how it performs while gaming. So for the first test I ran was a Cinebench test. In the multi-core test, I got a score of 1,663. Now if you compare it to a Ryzen 5 5500, which is a $100 processor, very budget-friendly processor, I got a score of 10,638 in that same test with that AMD processor. This just goes to show this processor is not very sicko mode when it comes to heavy CPU workloads. Now, if you move on to the gaming benchmarks, the first 3D Mark test I ran was the Firestrike Extreme test. Got a score of 14,241. I recently tested an old i5 4690K with a 3080, and I still got a very similar score. Now, if you compare it to the AMD Ryzen 5 5500, I paired it with a 3060 Ti, and I got a score of 13,254, which isn't that far off from a 4090. Now, when you pair the 4090 with a 13600K, you get 38,593. Completely annihilates it. Now, if we're comparing it in the Time Spy test, with the Pentium, I got a score of 8,538. And every other processor with even worse GPUs, like a 3080, 3060 Ti, and then obviously that i5 13600K with a 4090, just either beats it or just obliterates it. That's what happens when you pair an $80 CPU with pretty much a $1,700 GPU. Nothing good. Now, when it came to the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark, so I ran everything on high, at least as high as I could get it to go, 1440p. So my FPS wasn't terrible. I was hoping to get at least 60 FPS. For some reason, whenever it switched to the next scene, it took forever. I don't know why. And it would finally load. And when the test completed, I got an average of 56 FPS. I was hoping to get at least 60 FPS, but you know, it is what it is. It's a Pentium 4090. Couldn't quite put it on its back. The Shadow of the Tomb Raider game is a very CPU dependent game, so if your CPU sucks, your gameplay is gonna suck. You're better off spending like $200 on a CPU and $400, $500 on a GPU, and the gameplay would be perfectly fine. So now moving on to Cyberpunk. So I turned all the settings to high, turned ray tracing high, and when I ran the test, my FPS was not good at all. It's very choppy. It hurt my eyes. I had an average of 21 FPS, which is pretty trash, if you ask me. I was averaging at least 120 FPS with the 13600K with the 4090. Crazy bottleneck there. And the final game I ran was GTA 5. In 2023, it's a 10-year-old game. Let's just see what happens. So right as soon as we start, we're in the 60s. All right, so I'm consistently in the 60s. Sometimes it drops to the 40s, especially if I look at into the distance, it'll drop like into the 30s right now. Let's go to the beach. And the game looks pretty good. It's not lagging. I remember the last time I was playing with the Celeron, the background was disappearing. My FPS was like in the 20s, and it just honestly just sucked. This Pentium is actually an enjoyable experience. It's a perfect day to go to the beach. At the beach, 60 frames per second, no issues. Whoops. Yeah, this is a much better experience than the Celeron and the 4080. All right, so overall my FPS is consistently getting up into the 60s. Do I recommend this? No, go on, let's get out of here. At least it has hyper-threading, and the hyper-threading definitely helps, because with the Celeron it was just 2 cores and that was it. And like I said, when I was playing games, even GTA 5, a 10-year-old game, things were missing in the background, people were floating everywhere. It wasn't a good experience. This, on the other hand, I was actually able to play, except for the really intense games like Cyberpunk. I would say that game's not really playable. 4090 is capable of playing max settings on pretty much any game, but if you bottleneck it with a crappy enough processor, it actually won't be gameable on max settings. So, what did we learn from this? This CPU is pretty trash. We learned that an Intel Pentium Gold 6400 is not really... We learned a Pentium sucks. Just don't go with this configuration. I did this in the name of science. This is what happens when you pair a Pentium with an RTX 4090. Overall, I don't know why anybody would do this. I don't know why I even did it, but I did. Please like and subscribe, it really helps me out. If you have any questions or comments about the video, please leave them in the comments below. And like always, have a Sicko Mode day.